Throughout the dust-swept history of West Texas's Pecos Valley, few names commanded more respect than Jackson "Ghost Eyes" Callahan, a former Texas Ranger credited with bringing over 35 of the state's most dangerous fugitives to justice, dead or alive. Yet it wasn't his legendary career with the badge that would become his most enduring legacy, but rather the night he single-handedly defeated 17 armed men who made the fatal mistake of targeting his quiet ranch outside Terlingua. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sprawling ranchlands of Brewster County, Texas, stretched like an endless ocean of golden grass beneath the commanding silhouette of the Chisos Mountains. Here, in the summer of 2021, the rugged beauty of the Chihuahuan Desert created a stark paradise where independence and grit were as essential as water and shelter. Morning light painted the landscape in amber and rust, while evenings brought breathtaking sunsets that set the western sky ablaze with colors no artist could truly capture. It was precisely this combination of seclusion, self-governance, and respect for privacy that had drawn Jackson Callahan to Starlight Canyon. Here, a man could reinvent himself, or perhaps more accurately, could finally be himself without the weight of reputation or responsibility pressing down upon his shoulders. Residents of Terlingua first noticed the dust trail coming down Rattlesnake Ridge Road on a scorching Tuesday in mid-June. A meticulously maintained 1970s Ford Bronco in desert tan pulled a modest horse trailer toward town, moving at the unhurried pace of someone who respected both the treacherous road conditions and the power of the merciless sun overhead. Walter Simmons, owner of the Terlingua General Store and unofficial town chronicler, watched through sun-bleached windows as the vehicle came to a stop in front of his establishment. "Newcomer," he announced to the three regulars playing dominoes near the ancient ceiling fan. All four men observed with measured interest as the driver emerged from the Bronco. Jackson Callahan stood at an imposing 6'3", his frame lean and weathered like the mesquite trees that dotted the landscape. Despite the 103-degree heat, he moved with an efficiency that suggested no energy would be wasted, no motion without purpose. He was somewhere in his early 50s, though the desert had a way of aging a man's exterior while revealing his true character. His face bore the permanent tan of someone who'd spent decades under the southwestern sun, deep lines around his eyes, speaking to both squinting against harsh light and, perhaps, witnessing things most men never would. Most striking to Walter, who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before returning home to run his family's store, was the newcomer's awareness. Without appearing to do so, Callahan had already noted every vehicle on the street, every person within eyesight, and every potential approach to his position. He'd instinctively positioned himself with clear sight lines to all entries and exits, his back never fully exposed to any opening. "Military?" asked Hank Dawson, the oldest of the domino players and former county sheriff. "Maybe once," Walter replied, "but something different too. Look at his eyes." What Walter recognized was the hypervigilance that never truly leaves those who've lived with constant threat. The visitor's eyes, pale blue and startlingly intense against his sun-darkened skin, moved with practiced precision, cataloging details others would miss entirely. The locals didn't fail to notice how his right hand never strayed far from his hip, though no weapon was visible beneath his untucked chambray shirt. Callahan entered the store with the subtle grace of a mountain lion, the bell above the door, announcing his presence before he offered a respectful nod to the gathered men. "Afternoon," he said, his voice carrying the slight gravel of someone who used words sparingly. His accent placed him as Texan, though not from this particular region. "Help you find something?" Walter asked. noting how the man had already identified both the rear exit and the ancient Winchester mounted behind the counter, standard precautions for anyone who'd spent time in hostile territory. "Looking for Elena Martinez," Callahan replied. "Realtor. Was told she might help me find a property." Hank Dawson studied the newcomer with narrowed eyes. "Planning on staying a while, then? Most folks just pass through." "That's the plan," Callahan said, offering nothing more. What the Terlingua residents couldn't have known was that Jackson Callahan had spent nearly 18 months researching properties in remote sections of West Texas. He'd studied topographical maps, water resources, and sightlines with the same methodical precision he'd once used to track fugitives across unforgiving terrain. The ranch he ultimately purchased, the old McAllister place that had lain abandoned for nearly 7 years, offered everything he required: elevated position, multiple approach routes he could monitor, natural defensive features, and enough acreage to ensure privacy. Elena Martinez, whose family had been in Brewster County for 5 generations, found herself impressed by Callahan's knowledge of the region and property values. "You've done your homework," she commented, as they drove the rutted path toward the McAllister homestead. "Most buyers need convincing about the isolation. You seem to consider it a feature." "Spend enough time around people," Callahan replied, his eyes continuously scanning the horizon in a habit Elena recognized from her brothers who'd served in law enforcement. Looking for quiet. The old McAllister ranch sprawled across 380 acres of surprisingly varied terrain. A natural spring fed a modest year-round creek, liquid gold in this arid region. The main house, a sturdy stone and timber structure, built in the 1940s, sat atop a gentle rise with commanding views of the surrounding landscape. 2 outbuildings, a barn and corrals completed the immediate homestead, while the property extended to include a dramatic limestone ridge to the north. Janet McAllister, the elderly widow whose husband's passing had left the property untended, had rejected several offers from developers looking to parcel the land for vacation rentals. When Eleanor brought Callahan to meet her, the old woman studied him with shrewd eyes that had witnessed over 8 decades of desert life. "Are you aiming to change much?" she asked bluntly, her arthritic hands cradling a mug of coffee as they sat on her daughter's porch in Alpine. "No, ma'am," Callahan replied. "House needs work. Land needs respect. Plan to give both." Janet nodded, something in his straightforward manner reminding her of her late husband. Robert always said that land wasn't just dirt to own. It was a responsibility to steward. She studied Callahan's face, noting how he listened without interruption, how his eyes held steady when she spoke of her husband's dreams for the property. The developers wanted to put in vacation cabins, carve up the whole place, she continued. Robert would have hated that. His daddy homesteaded that land. 3 generations of McAllisters worked on it. "It'll stay whole," Callahan promised, the quiet certainty in his voice more convincing than any legal document. Later, Janet would tell her daughter, "There's something trustworthy about him. Reminds me of those old rangers in the stories my daddy used to tell, not much for talking, but when they give their word, it's gospel." What neither woman realized was how carefully Callahan had researched the McAllister family history before making his offer. Learning about Robert's military service, their reputation for fair dealing, and most importantly, their long-standing feuds with certain development interests in the county. Nothing in Callahan's life happened by accident, especially not his choice of property or the connections he cultivated. Sheriff Rebecca Hawkins noticed the newcomer within his first week in Terlingua. 20 years in law enforcement, 15 of them serving Brewster County, had honed her ability to read people, particularly those who carried themselves with the distinct bearing she recognized in Jackson Callahan. Rebecca had started her career with the El Paso Police Department before returning to her hometown, bringing urban policing experience to the vast, sparsely populated county. At 47, she commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation, her salt and pepper hair typically secured in a practical braid, her uniform impeccably maintained despite the dust that seemed to coat everything in West Texas. She first encountered Callahan at Miller's Hardware, where he was purchasing supplies for renovating the McAllister place. What caught her professional attention wasn't just his methodical selection of materials, but how he positioned himself in the store, back to the wall, clear sightlines to all entries, the subtle way he clocked every person who entered. Renovating. A big job for one man, she commented, approaching him directly. Direct had always been her style. No point dancing around in a county where everyone eventually knew everyone's business. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, offering a respectful nod that acknowledged her position without being deferential. Rebecca Hawkins, sheriff. She extended her hand. Jackson Callahan. His handshake was firm, calloused, and controlled, revealing hands that had seen both labor and action. "Military background?" she asked, noting the perfect posture and economy of movement. "Sometime in the army, long while back." The answer came smoothly, factually accurate, but deliberately incomplete. The sheriff's internal alerts ticked upward. Not with alarm, but professional curiosity. 2 decades of police work had taught her that people who answered questions too precisely often had something to hide. Still, nothing about Callahan's purchase of the McAllister Ranch raised legal concerns. His background check had come back clean, if surprisingly minimal for a man his age. "Well, Mr. Callahan, Terlingua peaceful. We like it that way." "That's why I'm here, Sheriff." Something in his pale blue eyes suggested deeper understanding, one professional recognizing another. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Anna Chen had a different perspective on the newcomer. As Terlingua's only physician operating a modest clinic that served the remote community, she encountered Callahan when he came in for a tetanus booster after cutting himself on rusted fencing. Dr. Chen, whose parents had immigrated from Taiwan and whose medical training at Johns Hopkins had prepared her for prestigious urban positions she'd rejected in favor of serving rural communities, approached her examination with professional thoroughness. Despite Callahan's attempt to minimize the visit, she insisted on a basic health assessment. "Blood pressure is excellent for a man your age," she commented, making notes in his newly created chart. "Though that right knee has seen better days." "Old injury," he offered simply. As she cleaned the laceration on his forearm, Dr. Chen couldn't help but notice the collection of scars that told their own story. A distinctive pattern of healed tissue on his left shoulder consistent with bullet fragmentation, surgical scars along his right side that suggested trauma repair rather than illness, and the knee that showed signs of multiple reconstructive procedures. "This wound on your arm," she said carefully, "doesn't match catching yourself on fencing. Clean edges, defensive positioning." Callahan's eyes met hers, reassessing her in light of her observation. "Caught it on a knife while breaking up a fight. Back when I worked security." Again, the answer came smoothly, plausible, perhaps even true, but incomplete. Dr. Chen nodded, recognizing the boundaries. Her father had been military police before becoming a surgeon, and she'd grown up recognizing the signs of men who carried more than physical scars. "The prescriptions for your knee, will you need those refilled? Manage without when I can." What Dr. Chen observed beyond the physical evidence was Callahan's extraordinary pain tolerance, his vigilant awareness even in the supposed safety of a medical office, and the precise way he scanned her credentials on the wall, noting her emergency medicine certification with particular interest. Her assessment, which she kept to her confidential notes, included likely extensive combat or law enforcement background, high functioning despite evidence of significant previous trauma, maintains operational security even in medical contexts. Terlingua's unofficial mayor, Miguel Suarez, whose family had operated the Desert Moon Cafe for 3 generations, formed his impressions of Callahan through the newcomer's dining habits. Callahan appeared every Sunday morning for breakfast, always arriving at 7:05 a.m., always sitting at the same corner table with his back to the wall. "Man's got military written all over him," Miguel confided to his wife Sophia. "Orders the same thing, eggs over medium, side of bacon, black coffee. Tips exactly 20% cash. Never uses his phone in public, always parks facing the exit." What fascinated Miguel was how Callahan interacted with the local community. He spoke little but listened intently, absorbing information about water rights disputes, problems with predators threatening livestock, and concerns about increased drug trafficking through remote ranch lands. When he did speak, people found themselves naturally deferring to his measured opinions. "Notice how he never drinks alcohol in public," Miguel observed after several weeks, "and how he always knows everyone in the room without seeming to look around. Reminds me of my Uncle Carlos when he came back from special forces, always calculating, always aware. Even the local teenagers formed opinions about the ranch's new owner." 17-year-old Dylan Whitehorse, whose Chiricahua Apache heritage gave him deep connection to the desert landscape, occasionally helped Callahan with fence repair and livestock management. Unlike many adults who treated teenagers as children, Callahan spoke to Dylan directly, teaching practical skills without condescension. "He showed me how to track animals using nearly invisible signs," Dylan told his friends. "Not just footprints, but bent grass stems, displaced pebbles, stuff I never would have noticed," said his grandfather taught him, but honestly it was like military tracking techniques my uncle learned in the service. Dylan's mother, Hannah Whitehorse, who served as Terlingua's postmaster, noticed how methodically Callahan had arranged his affairs. Unlike many newcomers who maintained connections to previous lives, Callahan received minimal mail, no personal letters, no magazines, nothing to suggest family ties or ongoing relationships elsewhere. His few packages contained practical supplies, security equipment, or reference materials about the region's history and terrain. "Man's either running from something or preparing for something," Hannah remarked to Sheriff Hawkins during their weekly coffee meeting. "Though I can't decide which concerns me more." What none of Terlingua's residents fully grasped was how carefully Jackson Callahan had chosen their community, how thoroughly he'd researched each of them before ever setting foot in Brewster County, and how methodically he was establishing himself as a respected but private presence. Each interaction, each piece of information shared or withheld, served his larger purpose, a purpose that had been forming since events set in motion years earlier in a dusty border town 300 miles west. Jackson Callahan settled into the McAllister Ranch with the methodical precision that had once made him legendary within the Texas Rangers. His renovation of the property proceeded according to a carefully orchestrated plan that prioritized security and tactical advantage while appearing, to casual observers, like typical homestead improvements. The main house underwent transformation first. Callahan reinforced exterior walls, installed impact-resistant windows that appeared vintage, but could withstand significant force, and modified door frames to accommodate hidden reinforcement bars. He constructed new interior walls, creating defensive positions that weren't immediately obvious to visitors. The electrical system was completely rewired to include redundant generators and a sophisticated off-grid solar array camouflaged to blend with the rugged landscape. "Man works like he's building a fortress, not a home," remarked Travis Holloway, the county's building inspector, after his initial visit. "Everything's up to code, but it's overbuilt by about 300%. Foundations reinforced beyond any requirement, sightlines from every window covering all approaches, even asked detailed questions about local flood patterns and prevailing wind directions during storms. What Travis didn't mention was the way Callahan had subtly probed for information about local emergency response times, law enforcement patrol patterns, and the reliability of cellular networks during extreme weather. The questions came naturally during their professional conversations, expertly woven into discussions about permits and building codes. Within 6 weeks, Callahan had established a daily routine that neighboring ranchers found admirable, if unusually disciplined. He rose before dawn, conducted property inspections along varying routes, tended to the small herd of cattle he'd acquired, and worked methodically on improvements until dusk. Sundays were his only deviation. Breakfast at the Desert Moon Cafe, followed by an hour at Terlingua's small, non-denominational church, though he never stayed for the social gathering afterward. Elena Martinez, who'd sold him the property, found herself increasingly curious about her most recent client. During a chance encounter at Miller's Hardware, she accepted his polite invitation to view the renovation progress. "I've sold properties in this county for 23 years, she told him as he showed her the restored main house, "and I've never seen improvements made with such thoroughness." Callahan nodded, pouring her fresh lemonade in the kitchen that now featured custom cabinetry with hidden compartments. "Figure if something's worth doing, it's worth doing right." Elena noticed how even the furniture placement seemed strategic, quality pieces arranged to provide cover from windows while maintaining clear paths to exits. The bookcases held an eclectic but telling collection: military history, Texas law enforcement memoirs, advanced agricultural techniques, and surprisingly, poetry collections by Frost and Whitman. "You've kept Robert McAllister's old gun cabinet," she observed, noticing the antique display case that had been carefully restored. "Seemed disrespectful to remove it," Callahan replied, though Eleanor couldn't help noticing that while the cabinet contained 2 vintage hunting rifles appropriate for display, they weren't the kind of weapons a man with his bearing would rely upon. As the summer progressed, Callahan expanded his improvements to the property boundaries. He repaired miles of fencing, installed solar-powered lighting at key points, and established water collection systems at strategic locations across the ranch. Local ranchers noted how his land management decisions reflected someone with extensive knowledge of both agriculture and security considerations. "Notice how he's grazing cattle in patterns." George Williams, whose family had ranched neighboring land for 4 generations, pointed out to his foreman, "rotates them through 5 different sections, but always keeps the approach roads visible. Man's using livestock as an early warning system." The vegetation management followed similar patterns. Callahan cleared brush from specific sight lines while encouraging growth in others, creating natural channels that would force any vehicle approaching the property to follow predictable routes. He planted native species that offered excellent cover near key vantage points, choices that appeared environmentally conscious to conservation-minded neighbors while serving tactical purposes trained eyes might recognize. His interactions with the Terlingua community remained cordial but measured. He attended county meetings, offered thoughtful input on water conservation initiatives, and made modest donations to local causes. When the volunteer fire department needed equipment upgrades, Callahan provided funds for advanced communications, gear that improved their response capabilities, equipment that also happened to extend reliable radio coverage to previously dead zones near his property. Sheriff Hawkins, whose professional instincts remained quietly alert, noticed Callahan's particular interest in regional law enforcement challenges. "Can't help noticing your attention during my presentation about cross-border trafficking," she commented, after a county safety meeting where she'd briefed residents on increased criminal activity in the region. "Most ranchers tune out the technical details. Situational awareness keeps people alive," Callahan replied, his pale eyes meeting hers directly. "Your department's stretched thin covering this much territory." "Nature of rural policing," she acknowledged. 3 deputies, and myself, covering nearly 7,000 square miles. Response times can be problematic. Man should be prepared to handle his own problems, Callahan observed. Neither a question nor a threat, simply a philosophy stated plainly. What Rebecca Hawkins couldn't know was how meticulously Callahan had been documenting the patterns she described, the undermanned checkpoints, the established trafficking routes, the increased boldness of cartel-affiliated groups operating in the region. Each piece of information was carefully filed away, combined with his own observations from long nights watching the landscape through military-grade optics from elevated positions on his property. Most telling to the observant residents of Terlingua were the strange inconsistencies in Callahan's technology use. For a man who claimed to seek isolation from modern complications, his property featured surprisingly sophisticated equipment carefully disguised as ordinary ranching infrastructure. Dylan Whitehorse, helping install what Callahan described as wildlife monitoring cameras, recognized the military-grade motion sensors and infrared capabilities of the devices being positioned at strategic points across the property. These aren't just for watching deer, the teenager observed carefully. Callahan studied the young man, reassessing his perceptiveness. Property this remote pays to know what's moving across your land. Coyotes, mountain lions, other predators. The way he said other predators sent a slight chill down Dylan's spine. For the first time, the teenager glimpsed something beneath Callahan's controlled exterior. A hardness born of experience with human predators far more dangerous than any wildlife. Walter Simmons, whose general store served as Terlingua's informal information exchange, noticed Callahan's peculiar purchasing patterns. While most ranchers bought supplies in predictable cycles, Callahan's acquisitions suggested someone preparing for various contingencies: water purification equipment, medical supplies that exceeded typical first aid needs, communications gear, capable of functioning during infrastructure failures, and unusual quantities of shelf-stable provisions. Planning for the apocalypse? Walter joked during one substantial purchase. Just prefer being prepared, Callahan replied without humor. Desert teaches you not to take the basics for granted. As autumn approaches, bringing marginally cooler temperatures to the Chihuahuan desert, Callahan's presence had evolved from novelty to fixture in the Terlingua community. His reputation solidified as a private but fair-minded neighbor, someone who helped when asked but never imposed, a man whose competence inspired confidence even as his reserve maintained distance. What no one yet understood was that every improvement to his property, every relationship cultivated in town, every piece of equipment installed, served dual purposes: the ordinary needs of ranch life and the carefully constructed infrastructure for what Callahan knew was coming. He'd chosen the McAllister property not just for its defensible features, but for its specific location, along routes that his extensive research identified as critical to operation of the Veracruz Syndicate, the criminal organization he'd spent the past 3 years tracking through official channels, and then, after his retirement, through methods that no badge would constrain. At night, when the property appeared dormant to distant observers, Callahan would sometimes climb to the limestone ridge on his northern boundary. From there, using advanced night vision equipment, he would monitor the desert landscape, tracking movement patterns that ordinary ranchers would never notice, documenting activity that local law enforcement lacked resources to observe. Each observation was meticulously recorded. Each data point added to the comprehensive intelligence picture he'd been building since events 3 years earlier had transformed him from lawman to hunter. During these solitary vigils, with only the vast canopy of stars as witness, the careful facade of Jackson Callahan, retired ranch owner, occasionally slipped. In these unguarded moments, the hardened vigilance of Ranger Captain Jackson Callahan, The man cartel lieutenants had called Ghost Eyes, for his uncanny ability to anticipate their movements, reasserted itself. His fingers would sometimes trace the scar tissue beneath his shirt where 3 bullets had torn through his body during the ambush that had killed his partner and triggered his obsessive quest for justice. "Almost time, Marcus," he would whisper to the memory of his fallen friend, studying the distant lights of vehicles moving across land where they had no legitimate reason to travel. "They think they've found new hunting grounds, but they don't realize they've walked into ours." The first signs of trouble in Terlingua appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when 3 black Ford expeditions with dark-tinted windows rolled slowly down the town's main street. The vehicles moved with deliberate purpose, their occupants hidden behind impenetrable glass as they conducted what was clearly reconnaissance, disguised as tourism. At the wheel of the lead SUV sat Victor Ramirez, though no one in Terlingua would know this name or recognize the significance of his presence in their isolated community. At 46, Ramirez carried himself with the confident authority of someone accustomed to command. His meticulously tailored clothing couldn't fully conceal the physicality of a man who had spent his formative years as an enforcer before rising through the ranks of the Veracruz Syndicate. His face bore the subtle marks of those violent years, a thin scar along his jaw, a slightly crooked nose that had been broken and improperly set, and eyes that revealed nothing while observing everything. Walter Simmons, restocking shelves in his general store, felt an instinctive unease as the vehicles cruised past. 20 years as a combat engineer in Afghanistan and Iraq had taught him to recognize predatory behavior, and there was something unmistakably predatory about these visitors. "Trouble," he muttered to himself, reaching for his phone to text Sheriff Hawkins. Inside the lead expedition, Victor Ramirez studied the town's layout with professional detachment. "Typical backwater," he commented to Alejandro Cortez, his head of security, who rode in the passenger seat. "One main road, minimal law enforcement presence, isolated properties, perfect staging ground." Cortez, younger than his boss, but with a similar history of violence, nodded in agreement. "Locals look soft, no real security anywhere. We could run everything through here with minimal resistance." Ramirez's organization had spent months identifying potential expansion territory for their trafficking operations. The remote stretches of Brewster County offered minimal law enforcement presence, established smuggling routes dating back generations, and strategic proximity to both interstate highways and the Mexican border. The Veracruz Syndicate had outgrown its traditional territories, and competition with larger cartels made expansion imperative. "What about local authorities?" Ramirez asked, noting the modest sheriff's substation they passed. "One sheriff, 3 deputies covering the entire county," Cortez replied, consulting a tablet containing their intelligence briefing. "Response times average 47 minutes to remote locations. No federal presence except sporadic border patrol." The third man in the vehicle, Diego Suarez, shifted uncomfortably in the back seat. Younger than his colleagues and newer to the organization, he served as their financial specialist, handling the increasingly complex money laundering operations that legitimized their profits. "These assessments assume cooperative locals," Diego pointed out, studying demographic data on his laptop. "These communities have deep roots. They might resist outside influence more than we anticipate." Ramirez smiled without warmth. "People choose cooperation when the alternatives are made clear to them. We're not asking permission, we're establishing parameters." The convoy continued its slow tour through Terlingua before proceeding down Highway 170, conducting similar assessments of Study, Butte, Legitus, and other small communities scattered across the region. Their behavior was calculated to be noticed, but not alarming. Prospective investors, perhaps, or developers scouting locations. They stopped occasionally to make small purchases, ask casual questions about local properties, take photographs that appeared tourist, while actually documenting security vulnerabilities. At the Desert Moon Cafe, Miguel Suarez watched the newcomers with immediate distrust as they occupied a corner table, speaking quietly among themselves while observing the restaurant's layout and clientele. "Something off about those guys," he told his wife Sophia as she prepared their order. "The way they're looking around, not like tourists admiring the place, more like they're casing it." The lead man approached the counter with practiced charm, ordering coffee with flawless but slightly accented English. "Beautiful area you have here," he commented, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Very peaceful." "We like it that way," Miguel responded, his tone making clear this wasn't just casual conversation. "Peace is valuable," Ramirez agreed, placing a $100 bill in the tip jar. "Worth protecting, wouldn't you say?" The implied threat wasn't lost on Miguel, whose family had fled similar intimidation tactics in Chihuahua decades earlier. He maintained eye contact, refusing to be intimidated in his own establishment. Sheriff Rebecca Hawkins received Walter's text while reviewing reports in her office. She immediately dispatched Deputy Carl Jenkins to conduct a routine patrol through a town, then accessed the county's limited traffic camera network to track the suspicious vehicles. Her instincts, honed by years of border region law enforcement, recognized the signature of cartel reconnaissance. She picked up her phone and dialed a number rarely used. "Mike, it's Becky Hawkins. Got some visitors in town that match your persons. Of interest list. 3 black expeditions, late models, appear to be conducting surveillance." She listened briefly. "Understood. We'll maintain observation only. Let me know if your people pick up anything." The Mike in question was Michael Garrison, her contact at the DEA's El Paso field office, with whom she maintained unofficial information, sharing that circumvented the bureaucratic delays of formal channels. By late afternoon, the convoy had completed its survey of the region and established temporary headquarters at the Starlight Ranch Resort, an upscale property on the outskirts of Terlingua that catered to wealthy tourists seeking authentic Western experiences with modern amenities. The resort's private cabins, discreet security, and no-questions-asked approach to affluent guests made it an ideal base of operations. In the resort's premium cabin, Victor Ramirez convened his leadership team to assess their findings. The gathering included Cortez and Suarez, along with 4 additional specialists: Eduardo Vega, their transportation coordinator; Maria Fuentes, intelligence and communications; Ricardo Delgado, enforcement specialist; and Thomas Parker, their Anglo facilitator, who handled interactions with corrupt officials and legitimate businesses. "Our assessment confirms the initial intelligence," Cortez reported, displaying a detailed map on a large monitor. "This region offers minimal resistance, established routes, and strategic position. Local infrastructure can be leveraged with modest investment and appropriate incentives." Maria Fuentes, whose background in military intelligence made her especially valuable, highlighted potential complications. "Local ranch owners control significant territory. Some properties have been in the same families for generations. These aren't corporate holdings we can manipulate through financial pressure. They're legacy operations with personal investment." "Everyone has a price," Ramirez countered. "Whether that's measured in dollars or blood depends on their cooperation." Parker, a former Border Patrol agent whose gambling debts had made him vulnerable to recruitment years earlier, pointed to specific properties on the digital map. "These 3 ranches control the most valuable corridors: Martinez Holdings to the west, Williams property here, and this one, the McAllister place, recently purchased by a newcomer named Callahan." Ramirez studied the property information with narrowed eyes. "What do we know about this Callahan?" Maria consulted her files. "Minimal digital footprint, Purchased property 6 months ago. Cash transaction through legitimate channels. No criminal record. Limited social media presence. Appears to be a retired security consultant. Retired security means former law enforcement or military, Cortez noted. Potential complication or potential asset, Ramirez countered. Former law enforcement often has useful connections, and everyone's corruptible if you identify the right pressure points. Find out everything about him, family, finances, vulnerabilities. As the meeting progressed, they outlined a comprehensive strategy for establishing control in the region. The plan would begin with legitimate business acquisitions. Parker had already identified struggling operations that could be purchased through front companies. These would provide cover for moving personnel into the area and establishing cash flow channels. The second phase would involve cultivating local allies through financial incentives, identifying corrupt officials receptive to bribes, and collecting compromising information on key community leaders. Those who couldn't be bought would be intimidated, and those who couldn't be intimidated would suffer accidents that appeared unconnected to syndicate activities. We move methodically, Ramirez instructed. No unnecessary violence, no attention-grabbing incidents. We establish presence first, then control. The locals need to understand their choices before any consequences become necessary. As darkness settled over the desert, the Veracruz syndicate's initial pieces moved into position. 2 advance teams established surveillance posts overlooking key transportation corridors. Technical specialists began mapping local communications infrastructure, identifying vulnerabilities they could exploit. Financial analysts evaluated local businesses for acquisition or pressure points. Unknown to Ramirez and his organization, their activities had not gone unnoticed. Sheriff Hawkins had quietly alerted trusted ranch owners about the suspicious visitors, though she kept her concerns measured to avoid creating panic. The DEA field office in El Paso had flagged the vehicle's license plates, connecting them to known Veracruz syndicate operations in Arizona and New Mexico. And at the McAllister Ranch, Jackson Callahan received the information through his own channels. An encrypted message from former ranger colleagues still active in border enforcement, and observations from his own surveillance network that had documented the convoy's movements throughout the day. Standing on his porch as evening painted the desert in deepening shades of purple and gold, Callahan studied distant dust trails through high-powered binoculars. His expression remained impassive, but those who knew him well would have recognized the slight tension in his jaw, the focused intensity that had once made him legendary within the Rangers. "Finally," he whispered to the empty air. After 3 years of patient tracking, the organization responsible for his partner's death had arrived exactly where he had predicted they would. The pieces were moving into place, just as he had planned. The Veracruz Syndicate wasted no time establishing their presence in Terlingua. Within 3 days of their arrival, Thomas Parker had made a cash offer for the struggling Rattlesnake Creek trading post, a combination gas station, convenience store, and liquor retailer strategically located at the junction of 2 main county roads. The owner, facing bankruptcy after 2 years of pandemic-related tourism decline, accepted eagerly. By the following week, renovations were underway, ostensibly to modernize the aging facility. Local contractors noticed the unusual emphasis on security features and the sophisticated communications equipment being installed, but the generous payment terms discouraged questions. Sheriff Rebecca Hawkins maintained discreet observation, documenting vehicle movements and personnel arrivals while coordinating with federal agencies. Her experience told her that direct confrontation without overwhelming force would be counterproductive, potentially endangering the community she was sworn to protect. "They're establishing infrastructure," she explained during a secure call with her DEA contact, moving pieces into place methodically. "These aren't street-level operators. This is coordinated expansion with professional oversight. On a crisp October morning, Jackson Callahan walked into Chen's Hardware to purchase fencing supplies. The store had become unexpectedly crowded, with several unfamiliar faces browsing merchandise with the casual disinterest of men who were actually conducting surveillance. At the counter stood Victor Ramirez and Alejandro Cortez, engaged in conversation with Linda Chen, the owner's daughter who managed inventory. "We're developing several properties in the region," Ramirez was explaining smoothly, "and looking to establish reliable supply chains for construction materials. Your operation appears well positioned to accommodate our needs." Linda, whose business instincts were tempered by the caution inherited from her father, maintained professional courtesy while revealing nothing. "We serve the entire county, but larger orders require advance notice. Our inventory is calibrated for local demand." Callahan moved through the store with unhurried purpose, selecting his items while maintaining awareness of every person in the space. To casual observation, he appeared focused on his shopping. In reality, he was cataloging faces, positions, the subtle bulges of concealed weapons, and the communications earpieces visible on two of the men. Victor Ramirez, whose survival had always depended on recognizing threats, noticed Callahan immediately. Something in the newcomer's movements, the economy of motion, the controlled awareness, the way he positioned himself with clear sightlines to all exits, triggered Ramirez's well-developed instincts. "And who might this be?" he asked Linda, his tone conversational though his eyes had hardened. "Jackson Callahan," Linda replied. "Purchased the old McAllister place earlier this year." Ramirez's recognition was immediate, but carefully concealed. The McAllister Ranch occupied critical territory along their planned transportation corridor. One of the three key properties their intelligence had identified for acquisition or control. Callahan approached the counter, placing his selections beside Ramirez's paperwork. The two men assessed each other with the measured calculation of predators, recognizing a potential threat. "Mr. Callahan," Ramirez offered his hand with practiced charm. "Victor Ramirez, Southwestern Development Group. We're investing in regional infrastructure improvements." Callahan accepted the handshake, his grip precisely calibrated, neither dominant nor submissive. "Plenty of space out here for development, assuming it's the right kind." The subtle challenge wasn't lost on Ramirez, whose smile remained fixed, while his eyes conducted a more thorough assessment. Callahan's weathered appearance suggested legitimate ranching, but his bearing revealed military or law enforcement background. The controlled alertness, the tactical positioning, the eyes, that catalog details most civilians would miss. "We believe in community partnership," Ramirez responded, "development that respects local character while bringing economic opportunity." "Interesting perspective," Callahan said, his voice neutral but carrying an undertone that raised Cortez's hackles. "Folks around here tend to appreciate straightforward dealings, not much patience for complicated arrangements." Ramirez's expression remained pleasant, though the temperature in his eyes dropped several degrees. "Business is always complicated, Mr. Callahan. Success depends on understanding the complexity and finding mutually beneficial solutions." "Some things aren't complicated at all," Callahan countered, meeting Ramirez's gaze directly. "Right and wrong, legal and illegal, those lines stay pretty clear out here." The tension crystallized between them. No overt hostility, nothing that onlookers would recognize as confrontational, but beneath the civil exchange, both men recognized the opening moves in a dangerous game. "Perhaps you'll join me for dinner," Ramirez suggested, his tone making clear this wasn't simply social. "Discuss the region's potential. I find local perspectives invaluable when entering new markets." "Appreciate the offer," Callahan replied. "But cattle don't feed themselves. Another time, perhaps." As Callahan collected his purchases and headed toward the door, Cortez shifted slightly, momentarily blocking the exit while pretending to examine a display of work gloves. It was a subtle intimidation tactic, establishing dominance through controlled space. Without breaking stride, Callahan adjusted his path with such fluid precision that Cortez found himself instinctively stepping aside, his body responding to subconscious threat recognition before his conscious mind processed what had happened. Outside in the parking lot, Ramirez watched through the store window as Callahan loaded his purchases into his Bronco. "Find out everything about him," he instructed Maria Fuentes, who had been monitoring the interaction from a parked vehicle. "Military record, financial status, family connections, pressure points. Something about him feels professional." "Already working on it," Maria replied, fingers moving across her laptop keyboard. "Preliminary background shows legitimate purchase of the McAllister property, retirement accounts consistent with security consulting, Texas residency for most of his life. Nothing suspicious on initial scan." "Dig deeper," Ramirez insisted, his instincts rarely wrong about potential threats. "No one develops that kind of situational awareness selling insurance. He's former military or law enforcement, possibly both." As Callahan drove away, he mentally catalogued the encounter. Ramirez matched the physical description from intelligence briefings, the cartel lieutenant who had rapidly expanded Veracruz syndicate operations across the Southwest, known for combining business acumen with calculated brutality. The timing aligned perfectly with Callahan's intelligence assessments, predicting their expansion into this corridor. Reaching a secluded turnout several miles from town, Callahan pulled over and retrieved a secure satellite phone from beneath his seat. The call connected after 2 rings. "They're here," he said without preamble. "Ramirez himself, plus Cortez and at least 6 operators I could identify. They're establishing cover through legitimate business acquisitions." The voice on the other end belonged to Captain James Sullivan, Callahan's former commander in the Rangers, who had maintained unofficial contact throughout Callahan's retirement. "Confirmed," Sullivan responded. "DEA tracked their convoy from El Paso. They've established similar beachheads in 3 other border regions in the past 18 months. Pattern suggests they'll move deliberately. Infrastructure first, then control of transportation corridors. They'll be evaluating existing properties for acquisition or pressure," Callahan noted. "Martinez and Williams ranches control the western corridors. My property blocks the eastern approach. They'll need all 3. Your cover holding? For now, basic background check will show legitimate retirement and property purchase. Deep dive might find inconsistencies. We've maintained the firewall between your official records and current status," Sullivan assured him. "As far as any database shows, you retired with full benefits after recovering from your injuries. Nothing connects you to the Matamoros operation or Marcus's death." Callahan's jaw tightened at the mention of his partner. "They'll make contact with local officials soon. Sheriff Hawkins seems straight, but the county commissioner has financial problems that make him vulnerable." "Understood. We'll continue monitoring through established channels. No official involvement unless you signal. You're still technically retired, Jackson. The Rangers can't protect you if this goes sideways." "Never expected protection," Callahan replied. "Just need them to stay out of my way until it's finished." After ending the call, Callahan continued toward his ranch, his mind processing the encounter from multiple angles. The confrontation had been inevitable. Ramirez would need to evaluate all major property owners as potential obstacles or assets. What Callahan hadn't anticipated was Ramirez leading the operation personally, suggesting the territory held greater strategic value than intelligence had indicated. At his ranch, Callahan initiated additional security protocols. He activated secondary surveillance systems covering approach routes, verified weapons caches positioned strategically throughout the property, and reviewed evacuation procedures he hoped wouldn't become necessary. That evening, in the main cabin, at Starlight Ranch Resort, Ramirez received the preliminary background report on Jackson Callahan. Maria Fuentes delivered her findings with professional efficiency, though her expression suggested frustration. His background checks out superficially, she reported. 20 years in private security after military service. Purchased the McAllister Ranch through legitimate channels. Credit history, tax records, property transactions all appear normal. But, Ramirez prompted, recognizing her reservation. The documentation is too perfect, she explained. No gaps, no inconsistencies, everything aligns precisely. In my experience, actual records contain minor discrepancies, address variations, employment, overlaps, inconsistent reporting formats across different agencies. His records look curated. Ramirez considered this assessment. Military background, Army, according to public records, honorable discharge in 2001, private security consulting afterward. What about personal connections, family, relationships? We can leverage, Maria shook her head. Minimal social footprint, no immediate family and public records, no active social media, limited community involvement since arriving in Terlingua. Ramirez drummed his fingers on the polished wooden table. His property blocks our eastern corridor. We need access to that land, one way or another. Standard approach, Cortez suggested. Generous offer first, followed by escalating pressure if necessary. No, Ramirez decided. Something about him suggests standard methods would be counterproductive. He recognized what we are, Alejandro. Most civilians don't see past our cover that quickly. Former law enforcement, Maria suggested. Possibly, or military intelligence. Either way, he represents a complication. Ramirez studied the property maps spread across the table. Continue monitoring him. Document routines, security measures, visitors. We need complete pattern analysis before deciding our approach. Thomas Parker, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke. If he is former law enforcement, he might have connections we could exploit. Retired officers often maintain relationships with active personnel. Good point, Ramirez acknowledged. Identify his contacts within local and state agencies. If he's connected, we need to know to whom and how deeply. As night settled over the Chihuahuan desert, both Callahan and Ramirez prepared for their next moves. Two experienced strategists had recognized each other as worthy adversaries, though neither yet understood the full scope of what they faced. The quiet confrontation in Chen's hardware had been merely the opening gambit in a deadly game about to engulf the remote community. Later that evening, Sheriff Hawkins made her routine patrol through Terlingua, deliberately driving past the Starlight Ranch Resort, where Ramirez had established his temporary headquarters. She noticed the increased security presence, men stationed at strategic points around the property perimeter, surveillance cameras freshly installed, and communications equipment being offloaded from unmarked vans. Rebecca pulled into the desert, Moon Cafe, where Miguel Suarez was closing for the night. The cafe owner had been her unofficial information source since she'd taken office, his establishment serving as neutral ground where locals shared observations they might hesitate to bring directly to law enforcement. They've been asking questions, Miguel told her quietly as he served coffee, not just about property values and business opportunities, specific questions about ranch boundaries, patrol schedules, which properties have security systems. Rebecca nodded, unsurprised but concerned. They approached anyone directly yet. Thomas Whitley sold his trading post to them yesterday. Cash deal, well above market value. They've been talking to Commissioner Davis, too. Private dinner at the resort last night. The mention of County Commissioner Richard Davis troubled Rebecca, more than she showed. The commissioner had opposed her department's budget requests for additional deputies and surveillance equipment for the past 2 years, citing fiscal responsibility while finding funds for projects that benefited his personal Interests. Davis has leverage over water rights for half the properties in the county, she noted. Perfect pressure point if someone wanted to influence land use decisions. Miguel wiped down the counter with methodical precision, his expression troubled. My cousin in Ojinaga says the Veracruz people moved into their region last year. Started with legitimate businesses, community development projects. 6 months later, anyone who opposed them had accidents or found themselves facing unexpected legal problems. Now they control everything from the sheriff's office to the school board. Rebecca considered this information, mentally adding it to her growing assessment of the situation. Keep your head down, Miguel. These people notice those who pay too. Much attention. What about Callahan? Miguel asked. He came by earlier and asked similar questions about our new visitors. What did you tell him? Just local observations. He listens more than he talks, but he seems to know what questions to ask. Man has the look of someone who's dealt with trouble before. Rebecca had been wondering about Jackson Callahan herself. Her background check had shown a legitimate property purchase and ordinary retirement history, but her instincts suggested there was more to the quiet rancher than appeared in official records. I'll stop by his place tomorrow, she decided. Compare. Notes. As she left the cafe, Rebecca noticed 2 men watching from a parked SUV across the street, the same men who had accompanied Ramirez during his initial tour of the town. They made no attempt to hide their surveillance, a deliberate message about the changing power dynamics in Terlingua. At the McAllister Ranch, Callahan was conducting his own intelligence gathering. Dylan Whitehorse had arrived an hour earlier, bringing information that the teenager had observed while making deliveries for Chen's Hardware. They've bought the old Whitley place, Dylan reported, accepting the coffee Callahan offered. Brought in construction crews from El Paso. They're installing something in the basement. Workers have to sign non-disclosure agreements, and they're screening for electronic devices before anyone goes down there. Callahan nodded, adding this information to his mental map of Ramirez's operation. The trading post's location made strategic sense. Positioned at the junction of county roads, it provided both legitimate business cover and excellent surveillance capability for monitoring traffic through the region. Anything else? He asked, noting how the teenager's observational skills had sharpened during their months of collaboration. Callahan had recognized Dylan's natural intelligence and remarkable situational awareness early in their acquaintance, seeing something of himself at that age. They offered jobs to 3 former Border Patrol agents living in the county, good money for security consulting. And they've been mapping the old ranch roads that don't appear on official county surveys. This last piece of information particularly interested Callahan. The historic cattle trails and unmapped ranch roads represented the region's most valuable asset for smuggling operations, routes known to local ranchers, but invisible to official enforcement efforts. You're observing well, Callahan acknowledged, but maintain distance. These aren't people who tolerate curiosity. Dylan nodded, understanding the warning. Mom says the same thing. She's worried about what's happening. Says it reminds her of stories her grandfather told about when the cartels first moved into our ancestral lands in the 1980s. After Dylan departed, Callahan secured the property for the night, activating motion sensors along the perimeter and confirming that his surveillance equipment was functioning properly. He then descended into the reinforced basement he'd constructed beneath the main house, a space unknown to anyone in Terlingua. The underground room contained an operations center that would have impressed professional intelligence agencies. Multiple monitors displayed feeds from cameras positioned across his property and along key approach routes. Secure communications equipment provided encrypted connections to still active contacts within law enforcement. A comprehensive array of weapons and tactical gear occupied one wall, while detailed maps and intelligence assessments covered another. Callahan accessed a secure server, downloading updated intelligence briefings from former colleagues who continued to share information outside official channels. The latest reports confirmed his assessment. Veracruz syndicate expansion followed established patterns, beginning with legitimate business acquisition and community infiltration before progressing to more direct control methods. What troubled him was Ramirez's personal involvement. Syndicate leadership typically remained insulated from frontline operations, directing activities through intermediaries to maintain deniability. Ramirez's presence suggested either particular interest in this territory or possibly knowledge of Callahan's presence. Callahan opened a secured file containing information about Operation Matamoros, the Joint Task Force operation 3 years earlier that had resulted in his partner's death and his own near-fatal injuries. The official investigation had attributed the ambush to opportunistic cartel violence, but Callahan's subsequent investigation revealed a carefully orchestrated trap based on leaked operational intelligence. The evidence trail had led to Victor Ramirez, though not directly enough for official action. After Callahan's official retirement, he had dedicated himself to building a case that would destroy not just Ramirez, but the entire Veracruz organization. The trail had led him to Terlingua, where geographic analysis and historical trafficking patterns suggested the syndicate would eventually establish operations. Now 3 years of patient preparation were approaching a culmination. Ramirez had arrived exactly where Callahan had predicted, unaware that the quiet rancher was actually the architect of an elaborate trap designed to accomplish what official channels had failed to do: bring justice for Marcus Sullivan and dismantle the organization responsible for his death. At the Starlight Ranch Resort, Ramirez was conducting his own strategic assessment. The main cabin had been converted into an operations center, with technical specialists establishing secure communications and intelligence analysts processing information about the region. Our geological survey confirms the preliminary assessment, Ricardo Delgado reported, displaying subsurface imaging on the main screen. The limestone formations create natural tunnels beneath several key properties. With minimal excavation, we could establish completely concealed transportation corridors connecting to existing networks across the border. Ramirez studied the geological maps with interest. The natural cave systems beneath the Chihuahuan Desert had been used by indigenous peoples for centuries before becoming smuggling routes during Prohibition. Modern surveillance technology had rendered many traditional crossing points obsolete, but subterranean pathways remained virtually undetectable. "Property acquisition status?" he asked, turning to Thomas Parker. "We've secured the Whitley trading post and made offers on 3 smaller properties," Parker reported. "The Martinez family has rejected initial overtures. They've held their land for 6 generations and appear immune to financial incentives. Williams seems open to partnership arrangements, but not outright sale. And Callahan?" Parker shook his head. "No approach made yet, per your instructions. We're still gathering intelligence." Maria Fuentes interrupted with new information. "We've identified a potential connection between Callahan and law enforcement. His property has received 3 visits from Sheriff Hawkins in the past month, duration suggesting more than routine community policing." Ramirez considered this development. The sheriff bears watching. Her record shows no corruption, no financial vulnerabilities, strong community ties. "Every official has pressure points," Cortez observed. "Family, reputation, career ambitions. We just need to identify hers. Proceed carefully," Ramirez cautioned. "Clumsy pressure on law enforcement attracts federal attention. We establish legitimate presence first, then leverage influence through proxies. Commissioner Davis is already receptive to financial incentives. We'll work through established channels where possible." Diego Suarez, reviewing financial intelligence, identified another potential avenue. The county faces significant budget shortfalls after pandemic-related tourism decline, we could establish a community development foundation, legitimate philanthropic efforts that create political capital while providing excellent cover for moving assets into the region. Ramirez nodded approvingly. This balanced approach had become the syndicate's signature under his leadership, combining traditional intimidation tactics with sophisticated financial and political strategies that created multiple layers of protection. Around their core operations, implementation timeline, he asked. Phase 1 has already been initiated, Cortez replied. Infrastructure acquisition underway, surveillance network, establishing baseline patterns, initial community assessment complete. Phase 2, territorial control measures, can begin within 2 weeks. Accelerate the timeline, Ramirez directed, his expression hardening. Something about this situation feels wrong. Callahan concerns me. His property's strategic position is too perfect, his background too clean. Expand surveillance on him immediately. I want to know his movements, his contacts, his resources. As the operation continued into the night, neither Callahan nor Ramirez fully appreciated how their careful strategies were about to collide, or how their personal vendetta would engulf the entire community in violence that had been brewing since that bloody day in Matamoros 3 years earlier. The truth about Jackson Callahan might have remained hidden if not for the arrival of Captain James Sullivan. The veteran Texas Ranger commander pulled into Terlingua 2 days after Ramirez's appearance, driving an unmarked department SUV with government plates. His arrival attracted immediate attention in the small community, where any new face generated interest, and a law enforcement vehicle triggered particular curiosity. Sullivan, at 58, carried himself with the quiet authority that came from 3 decades with the legendary law enforcement agency. His weathered face bore the permanent squint of a man who'd spent his career in the harsh Texas sun, while his measured movements revealed both the discipline of long service and the caution of someone who'd survived multiple encounters with the state's most dangerous criminals. Sheriff Hawkins intercepted Sullivan outside her office, recognizing the significance of a ranger captain arriving unannounced in her jurisdiction. "Captain Sullivan," she greeted him, extending her hand. "Rebecca Hawkins, what brings Texas Rangers to our quiet corner of nowhere?" Sullivan shook her hand with professional courtesy. "Following up on some intelligence regarding Veracruz syndicate expansion. Your office flagged some vehicles associated with their operation." Rebecca studied the Ranger with professional assessment. Upper-level commanders rarely conducted field investigations personally unless something significant was involved. "Happy to share what we've observed," she offered, "though I'm curious why this warrants a captain's attention rather than a field investigator." Sullivan's expression revealed nothing. "Ongoing case with particular sensitivities. Mind if we talk inside?" In her office, with the door closed and after a discreet electronic sweep for surveillance devices, Sullivan's demeanor shifted subtly. "What I'm about to share is classified, Sheriff. It doesn't leave this room, and it doesn't appear in any official reports." Rebecca nodded, recognizing the gravity of the situation. "Understood." Sullivan activated a secure tablet displaying a personnel file with a photograph that immediately caught Rebecca's attention, a younger Jackson Callahan in Texas Ranger uniform. "Captain Jackson Callahan," Sullivan began, 18 years with the Rangers, specialized in border operations and cartel infiltration, one of our most decorated officers before his retirement 3 years ago. Rebecca's professional composure couldn't entirely mask her surprise. "Callahan is a former Ranger captain. His background check showed private security work. His official records were modified as part of an ongoing operation," Sullivan explained. 3 years ago, Callahan was leading a joint task force targeting Veracruz syndicate operations in Matamoros. The operation was compromised, resulting in an ambush that killed his partner, Marcus Sullivan, my younger brother, and left Callahan with near-fatal injuries. The personal connection explained the captain's involvement. Rebecca remained silent, allowing Sullivan to continue. The official investigation concluded with typical bureaucratic caution, insufficient evidence to determine the source of the intelligence breach. Callahan believed otherwise. He identified Victor Ramirez as the architect of the ambush, though he couldn't prove it through official channels. So he retired to pursue it unofficially, Rebecca concluded, the pieces falling into place. Sullivan nodded. After recovering from his injuries, Callahan submitted his retirement paperwork. Officially, he's a former ranger receiving disability benefits who purchased a quiet ranch to enjoy his retirement. Unofficially, he's hunting Ramirez, Rebecca finished, and he chose Terlingua because intelligence suggested Veracruz would expand operations here. Callahan spent 18 months analyzing Veracruz expansion patterns, transportation corridors, and historical smuggling routes. He identified this region as their most likely next target and positioned himself accordingly. Rebecca processed this information with growing concern. "Is this a sanctioned operation, Captain?" Sullivan's hesitation told her everything before he spoke. Officially, the Rangers have no knowledge of Callahan's activities. Unofficially, certain personnel maintain communication and provide intelligence support outside official channels. You're letting a retired ranger with a personal vendetta run an unsanctioned operation in my jurisdiction, Rebecca stated flatly, professional concern overwhelming her initial impression. Callahan isn't just seeking personal vengeance, Sullivan countered. He's building a case that official channels couldn't establish. The Veracruz Syndicate has infiltrated multiple law enforcement agencies along the border. Official operations are compromised before they begin. Sometimes the only way to pursue justice is outside the system. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, considering the implications. I'm responsible for this community's safety, Captain. I can't have a vigilante operation endangering civilians, regardless of how justified the cause might be. Callahan isn't a vigilante, Sullivan insisted. He's gathering intelligence, building a case that will stand in court. He won't move without actionable evidence. Unless Ramirez pushes him, Rebecca observed. You and I both know what happens when operations get personal. Sullivan couldn't dispute this assessment. That's partly why I'm here. Ramirez's personal involvement changes the equation. We need to ensure Callahan maintains operational discipline. We? Rebecca raised an eyebrow. I'm requesting your cooperation, Sheriff. Maintain normal operations, share information through established channels, but allow Callahan room to maneuver. When this concludes, we'll have the evidence to dismantle the entire Veracruz operation, not just arrest a few frontline operators. Rebecca considered her options, professional obligation warring with practical reality. I'll need direct communication with Callahan. No more lone wolf operations in my jurisdiction without my knowledge. That can be arranged, Sullivan agreed, but your official posture remains unchanged. As far as any records show, Jackson Callahan is simply a retired security consultant who purchased property in your county. After Sullivan departed, Rebecca drove directly to the McAllister Ranch, her perspective on its owner fundamentally altered by the morning's revelations. She found Callahan mending fences in the north pasture, the picture of ordinary ranching life that now seemed an elaborate cover for the sophisticated operation beneath. Captain Callahan, she called as she approached, deliberately using his former rank. Callahan straightened, observing her with new awareness. Sullivan visited you. Filled in some significant blanks, she confirmed, though I suspect not all of them. Callahan set aside his tools, gesturing toward the house. Better continue this conversation inside. In his kitchen, with coffee poured and security measures activated, Callahan outlined the operation more completely. He revealed the sophisticated surveillance network he'd established, the intelligence he'd gathered on Veracruz operations across 3 states. and his methodical documentation of their financial structures, political connections, and enforcement mechanisms. This isn't just about Ramirez, he explained, showing her digital evidence compiled over 3 years. The syndicate has compromised officials in 7 counties, established legitimate business fronts, laundering millions in drug profits, and developed infrastructure that serves their entire operational network. Taking down Ramirez alone accomplishes nothing. The organization continues under new leadership. Rebecca studied the evidence with professional assessment. This is comprehensive work, but it doesn't justify operating unilaterally in my jurisdiction. I'm not asking permission, Sheriff, Callahan stated evenly. Just understanding. Ramirez will establish operational control through legitimate means first. Business acquisitions, political influence, community investment. Then comes territory enforcement, pressure on local ranchers, control of transportation corridors. The violence starts small: property damage, intimidation, unexplained accidents. By the time it escalates to levels that justify official intervention, they've already established control. And your alternative? Document everything. Build a case that connects Ramirez to every aspect of the operation. Then bring the entire structure down simultaneously. Ramirez, their financial network, their corrupted officials, everything. Rebecca considered his approach. And Marcus Sullivan, your partner's death is just incidental to this larger mission. Something flickered in Callahan's eyes, a momentary glimpse of the personal motivation beneath the professional operation. Justice for Marcus requires dismantling what killed him, he said finally. Taking down Ramirez alone wouldn't accomplish that. Rebecca made her decision. I'll maintain official distance, but I want regular briefings. My priority remains this community's safety. If your operation endangers that, I'll shut it down regardless of your broader objectives. Are we clear? Perfectly, Callahan agreed, recognizing both her authority and the practical compromise she was offering. As Rebecca departed, neither she nor Callahan noticed the discreet surveillance drone hovering at extreme range, its high-powered optics capturing their meeting for analysts at the Starlight Ranch Resort. At the Veracruz Syndicate's temporary headquarters, Maria Fuentes reviewed this footage with growing concern. Sheriff Hawkins spent 47 minutes at Callahan's ranch, she reported to Ramirez. Earlier today, she met with this visitor. The image on screen showed Captain Sullivan entering the sheriff's office. Texas Ranger, Ramirez identified. Immediately, his expression darkening. Specialized vehicle, government plates, not a routine visit. Our sources in the Rangers can't access his mission briefing, Maria continued. The files restricted to command-level authorization only. Ramirez studied the images with narrowed eyes, and immediately afterward, the sheriff visits Callahan. The connection we suspected is confirmed, though its nature remains unclear. Alejandro Cortez, reviewing property records, contributed additional information. Callahan's property purchase shows inconsistencies when examined closely. The financial trail is legitimate on surface inspection, but deeper analysis reveals sophisticated structuring to obscure the funding source. Diego Suarez concurred from his financial analysis. The transaction pattern matches government operation protocols, clean enough for casual inspection, but containing signature elements of law enforcement funding mechanisms. Ramirez absorbed this information with calculating precision. So our quiet rancher is connected to law enforcement, possibly undercover or recently retired. The ranch's strategic position blocking our eastern corridor isn't coincidental, it's deliberately positioned. Should we eliminate him? Cortez asked directly, always preferring decisive action. Not yet, Ramirez decided. If he's running an authorized operation, elimination would trigger immediate federal response. We need to understand exactly what we're facing first, expand surveillance, identify his communication channels, determine whether he's operating officially or as a rogue element. What Ramirez couldn't know was how personal this operation was for Callahan, how thoroughly the former ranger had prepared for this confrontation, or how completely he had anticipated Veracruz's tactical responses. The game had evolved beyond organizational expansion into something more dangerous, a personal contest between two strategic minds, each determined to destroy the other. 3 days after Sullivan's visit, Ramirez convened his leadership team for comprehensive operational planning. The main cabin's dining room had been converted to a secure briefing center, with electronic countermeasures preventing surveillance and armed security ensuring privacy. "Our intelligence assessment is complete," Maria Fuentes announced, presenting her findings to the assembled team. Jackson Callahan's background is significantly more complex than initial investigation suggested. She displayed comprehensive intelligence on the main screen: service records, operational histories, financial transactions, and surveillance photographs. Former captain with the Texas Rangers, specialized in border operations and cartel infiltration. 18-year service record including multiple high-value target acquisitions. Officially retired following injuries sustained during an operation in Matamoros 3 years ago. Ramirez's expression remained neutral, though those who knew him well recognized the dangerous stillness that indicated intense focus. "The Matamoros operation," he said quietly. "Yes," Maria confirmed. "Callahan led the joint task force that targeted our Matamoros distribution network. Official records indicate the operation was compromised, resulting in an ambush that killed his partner and left Callahan severely wounded. And now he's here," Ramirez observed, "on property that happens to control our primary transportation corridor, just as we expand operations into this region. This isn't a coincidence. He's hunting us, hunting me specifically." The implications rippled through the leadership team. What had appeared to be standard territory expansion had suddenly revealed itself as something more dangerous, a carefully planned operation targeting their organization. "Confirmation of law enforcement connection changes our operational parameters," Cortez noted, always focused on security implications. "If Callahan is running an authorized operation, there's likely surveillance we haven't detected, possibly federal resources deployed in the region." Thomas Parker, whose background in Border Patrol gave him particular insight, offered a different assessment. "The operational profile doesn't match standard law enforcement protocols. No visible surveillance teams, no increased federal presence. In surrounding jurisdictions, no heightened Border Patrol activity. This has the hallmarks of an unsanctioned operation." Ramirez considered this analysis. "A personal vendetta, then. Callahan believes we were responsible for his partner's death and has positioned himself to pursue revenge outside official channels. That presents both threat and opportunity," Diego Suarez observed. "Unsanctioned operations lack institutional support, but also operate without institutional constraints, meaning Callahan might be more dangerous precisely because he's not following official protocols," Ramirez concluded, "but also more vulnerable because he lacks organizational backup." The assessment shifted operational planning fundamentally. What had been designed as territorial expansion now required adaptation to counter a specific threat from a highly trained adversary with personal motivation. "Revise the operational timeline," Ramirez instructed. "We accelerate legitimate business establishment to reinforce our public cover while simultaneously preparing more aggressive measures against specific targets. The Callahan property remains the primary obstacle to establishing our eastern corridor," Cortez reminded him. "Standard acquisition approaches seem unlikely to succeed given his motivation." Ramirez's expression hardened. Then we pursue alternative approaches, identify his vulnerabilities, not just physical security, but psychological pressure points. Everyone has something they value beyond themselves. The planning session continued into the night, with specialists developing multi-layered approaches to neutralizing Callahan while establishing operational control of the region. The strategy that emerged combined sophisticated intelligence gathering, political influence through Commissioner Davis, economic pressure through water rights manipulation, and targeted intimidation of strategic property owners. Williams Ranch controls the northwest access roads, Parker noted, highlighting the property on their digital map. Owner has significant gambling debts in Las Vegas. Financial pressure should secure cooperation without requiring outright acquisition. Martinez holdings present different challenges, Cortez continued. 5 generations of family ownership, no financial vulnerabilities, strong community standing. Direct pressure is likely counterproductive. Their grandson attends University of Texas at El Paso, Maria observed. Creating leverage through family members presents a viable alternative to direct confrontation. Ramirez approved these approaches while maintaining focus on the central challenge. All subsidiary operations proceed as planned, but Callahan remains our primary concern. I want comprehensive surveillance, complete pattern analysis, identification of all contacts and resources. If he's building a case against us, I need to know exactly what evidence he possesses and where it's stored. What about Sheriff Hawkins? Parker asked. Her meeting with Callahan suggests she may be aware of his true identity and purpose. The sheriff presents a complex challenge, Ramirez acknowledged. Her record shows no corruption, strong community, support and connections to federal agencies that make direct approaches risky. Commissioner Davis provides indirect influence over department resources, but direct confrontation with Hawkins would draw unwanted attention. We could manufacture legal complications, Diego suggested. Our contacts in the county attorney's office could generate investigations that occupy her attention without directly challenging her authority. Ramirez nodded approval. Proceed with that approach. Keep her occupied with administrative and jurisdictional challenges while we establish operational control. As the syndicate refined their strategy, Ramirez withdrew to the cabin's private office for a secure call to his superiors in Mexico City. The organization's leadership needed to understand the changed operational parameters and additional resources required to address this unexpected complication. The situation has evolved beyond standard territory expansion, he explained to Emilio Vargas, the syndicate's senior strategist. We're facing a deliberate counter-operation established specifically to target our organization. Vargas's voice carried the weight of authority earned through decades in the shadows of cartel operations. Your assessment of Callahan's resources? Is he operating alone or with institutional support? Evidence suggests limited official support. Intelligence. Sharing, perhaps, but not operational resources. His approach is too personal for sanctioned operations. Then eliminate him, Vargas stated simply. One man, however skilled, cannot stand against our complete resources. The situation requires more nuance, Ramirez countered carefully. Eliminating Callahan without understanding the extent of his evidence gathering could trigger contingency protocols we haven't identified. He spent 3 years preparing for this confrontation. We must assume he's established deadman switches and evidence distribution mechanisms. After lengthy discussion, Vargas authorized additional resources while emphasizing operational security. Your primary mission remains establishing the Eastern Corridor. Neutralize Callahan by whatever means necessary, but ensure no connection can be traced to our broader organization. If this is personal between you and him, keep it contained. The call confirmed what Ramirez had suspected. The organization viewed Callahan as his responsibility, a complication arising from past operations that now threatened current expansion. Success would reinforce Ramirez's value. Failure would make him expendable. As midnight approached, Ramirez stood on the cabin's porch, surveying the darkened landscape. Somewhere out there, Jackson Callahan was watching, waiting, pursuing his own vendetta with the patience and precision that had made him legendary within law enforcement circles. For the first time in years, Ramirez felt something approaching: uncertainty. He had built his reputation on strategic foresight, on anticipating and neutralizing threats before they materialized. Yet Callahan had positioned himself perfectly, had prepared for this confrontation with a thoroughness that suggested he understood not just Veracruz operations, but Ramirez himself. The question that troubled him, as he studied the star-filled Texas sky, was whether Callahan's presence was reactive or anticipatory, whether the former ranger was responding to Veracruz expansion or had somehow influenced it, creating circumstances that would draw Ramirez personally into his carefully prepared battlefield. Across miles of darkness, on the elevated ridge of his property, Jackson Callahan watched the lights of the Starlight Ranch Resort through high-powered optics. 3 years of patient preparation were approaching the culmination. Ramirez had arrived exactly where Callahan had predicted, bringing with him the organizational resources and personal connections that would finally allow Callahan to fulfill his promise to Marcus. The game had begun, though neither man yet fully appreciated how their mutual determination would transform the peaceful Terlingua community into a battlefield where old debts would finally be settled in blood. The waxing moon cast silver light across the McAllister Ranch as Jackson Callahan completed his final preparations. For 3 years, he had transformed the property into an intricate defensive system, disguised as ordinary ranching improvements. Now, with Ramirez's operation accelerating, the time had come to activate contingency measures developed during countless hours of tactical planning. In the pre-dawn darkness, Callahan moved through his property with practiced stealth, checking security positions established months earlier. Each location had been chosen with precision, offering overlapping fields of fire, protected approaches, and natural concealment that even professional observers would struggle to identify. At the limestone ridge forming his northern boundary, Callahan verified the motion sensors disguised as wildlife monitoring equipment. The sophisticated system could distinguish between animal movement and human intrusion, transmitting encrypted alerts to multiple devices. Similar sensors protected every approach to the main house, creating an invisible perimeter that would detect any unauthorized presence. The defensive preparations represented only one aspect of Callahan's strategy. Equally important was the elaborate intelligence-gathering network he'd established throughout the region. Strategic placement of surveillance equipment along likely trafficking routes had documented Veracruz operations across 3 counties, creating an evidentiary foundation that would eventually dismantle their entire organization. Returning to the main house as first light touched the eastern horizon, Callahan activated secure communications to update Captain Sullivan. "Ramirez has accelerated his timeline," he reported, transmitting encrypted surveillance footage. "They've established operational headquarters at the Starlight Resort, purchased the Whitley Trading Post as a distribution center, and begun approaching local property owners with acquisition offers." Sullivan's voice carried both professional assessment and personal concern. "Your cover remains intact?" "For now. They're investigating my background, but the digital trail leads to verified identities. More concerning is their approach to neighboring properties. They've secured access to the Williams Ranch through financial leverage and begun pressuring the Martinez family through their college-age grandson." Classic cartel methodology, Sullivan observed. Financial incentives first, then progressive pressure against resistance. How's Sheriff Hawkins handling the situation? Professionally, she's maintaining official distance while sharing intelligence through secure channels. Ramirez is attempting to neutralize her through political pressure on department resources. The conversation shifted to operational contingencies. Sullivan had arranged additional resources, intelligence support from trusted rangers operating outside official channels, satellite surveillance access through Pentagon contacts, and evidence protection protocols that would ensure Callahan's accumulated intelligence reached federal prosecutors regardless of operational outcome. DEA has established a covert observation post near Study Butte, Sullivan informed him. No direct involvement without actionable evidence, but they're monitoring Veracruz movements in the region. Border Patrol has quietly increased presence along likely trafficking routes. Not enough to spook Ramirez. Presented as standard operational adjustments, nothing that would trigger their counter-surveillance. After securing communications, Callahan descended to his underground command center. The reinforced basement contained an operations hub that would impress federal agencies. Multiple workstations monitoring surveillance feeds, secure servers storing encrypted evidence, and communications equipment maintaining connections with trusted assets. The evidence wall displayed the culmination of 3 years' investigation, photographs connecting Veracruz operatives to trafficking operations across 5 states, financial records documenting money laundering through legitimate businesses, transcripts revealing political influence through strategic donations, and operational timelines reconstructing the Matamoros ambush that had killed Marcus Sullivan. Callahan studied the evidence methodically, his expression revealing nothing of the personal motivation driving this meticulous preparation. To anyone observing, he appeared the consummate professional, analytical, measured, disciplined. Only in unguarded moments, when his gaze lingered on photographs of his fallen partner, did glimpses of the underlying drive emerge. The immediate tactical situation required assessment. Surveillance indicated Ramirez had deployed advanced teams throughout the region, establishing observation posts, mapping potential routes, and identifying security vulnerabilities. Their operational profile suggested preparation for aggressive territorial control rather than cautious infiltration. Callahan had anticipated this escalation. His defensive preparations included countermeasures for scenarios ranging from surveillance to direct assault. Each approach to his property contained hidden defensive positions, pre-sighted fields of fire, and obstacles designed to channel movement through predictable vectors. More subtle preparations extended beyond physical security. Callahan had established information channels through key community members. Miguel Suarez at the Desert Moon Cafe provided intelligence on visitor activities. Dylan Whitehorse reported unusual movements observed during his deliveries. Dr. Chen tracked medical supplies purchased by newcomers that might indicate preparation for combat operations. These human intelligence sources complemented technical surveillance, creating a comprehensive awareness network that allowed Callahan to track Veracruz activities throughout the region. The system had already documented their approach to Commissioner Davis, their surveillance of Sheriff Hawkins, and their preliminary assessment of potential trafficking corridors. As morning fully illuminated the rugged landscape, Callahan completed system checks on his defensive infrastructure. Remote cameras verified clear fields of fire from concealed positions. Reinforced doors and impact-resistant windows provided hardened defensive positions within the main house. Distributed supply caches ensured access to essential resources. Regardless of position, the most sophisticated preparations remained invisible to casual observation. Strategic landscaping channeled approach routes through areas covered by overlapping fields of fire. Irrigation improvements doubled as defensive. Trenches offering protected movement between positions. Outbuildings positioned for agricultural efficiency also provided tactical advantages. Clear sightlines, reinforced construction, multiple egress options. Callahan's preparations extended beyond his property. He had established fallback positions. Throughout the region, abandoned mining structures, remote hunting blinds, natural formations offering defensive advantages. Each location contained cached supplies, communications equipment, and evidentiary backups ensuring operational continuity, regardless of primary position status. By mid-morning, Dylan Whitehorse arrived with new intelligence gathered during deliveries to the Starlight Ranch resort. "They've brought in new people," the teenager reported, accepting coffee in Callahan's kitchen. 4 men with military bearing, different from the security personnel. They're conducting property assessments along the eastern approach roads, paying particular attention to your boundary markers. Callahan absorbed this information with professional detachment. Vehicle descriptions: 2 black Jeep Cherokees, mud-covered license plates. They've been stopping at elevated positions overlooking your property, using advanced optics for observation. One carried what looked like electronic warfare equipment, signal intelligence gathering rather than simple surveillance. The sophistication of Dylan's observations confirmed Callahan's assessment of the young man's potential. What had begun as casual employment had evolved into careful mentorship, with Callahan recognizing in Dylan the same observational skills and situational awareness that had distinguished his own early career. "Maintain distance," Callahan instructed. "Observe patterns, but avoid direct contact. These aren't ordinary security contractors. They're experienced field operators with extensive combat training." After Dylan departed, Callahan contacted Sheriff Hawkins through secure channels, sharing intelligence on the new Veracruz personnel while receiving updates on law enforcement positioning. "Commissioner Davis has called an emergency budget meeting," Rebecca reported, "attempting to restrict patrol resources in outlying areas, particularly routes approaching your property. I've countered by redistributing personnel under traffic. Safety justifications, but political pressure is intensifying. They're establishing observation posts along my eastern boundary," Callahan informed her. "Professional operators, likely former military. Pattern suggests preparation for direct action rather than continued surveillance. Timeline? Accelerating. Ramirez hasn't achieved the political leverage he wanted, and my presence represents an obstacle to their transportation corridor. They'll move against neighboring properties first, establishing operational control of surrounding territory before addressing me directly." Rebecca's concern was evident despite professional detachment. "The Martinez family refused their offer yesterday, based on established patterns that places them at immediate risk. I've established surveillance coverage of their main residence," Callahan assured her. "Any approach will trigger alerts to both of us." As afternoon progressed, Callahan's surveillance network detected increased Veracruz movement throughout the region. Technical specialists were establishing communications infrastructure at strategic locations. Security teams were conducting pattern analysis of local law enforcement movements. Financial representatives were approaching business owners with investment proposals that offered legitimate cover for money laundering operations. Most concerning was targeted surveillance against specific properties, focused observation of the Martinez Ranch, monitoring of Sheriff Hawkins' movements, and comprehensive assessment of Callahan's security measures. The operational tempo suggested Ramirez was compressing his timeline, accelerating from infiltration to control phases more rapidly than standard doctrine suggested. Callahan recognized the implications immediately. Something had changed Ramirez's risk assessment, pushing him toward more aggressive measures despite the potential attention such actions might attract. The most likely explanation was discovery of Callahan's true identity. Ramirez had identified him as a former ranger and now perceived him as an immediate threat rather than a simple obstacle. This acceleration required tactical adjustments. Callahan activated additional surveillance positions covering likely approach routes. He verified communications with trusted assets in the region. Most importantly, he implemented evidence protection protocols, ensuring that the intelligence he'd gathered would reach federal authorities regardless of operational outcome. As sunset approached, Callahan received encrypted communication from Captain Sullivan. "Satellite surveillance confirms increased movement at Ramirez's compound," Sullivan reported. "Tactical vehicles being prepared, personnel gathering for briefing. Pattern suggests preparatory staging for night operations." Assessment? They're moving sooner than expected. Our intelligence indicates they've identified your law enforcement background and accelerated operational timelines in response. DEA assets report equipment consistent with tactical assault rather than simple surveillance or intimidation. The implications were clear. Ramirez had abandoned measured expansion in favor of direct action, perceiving Callahan as an immediate threat requiring neutralization. The operational profile suggested professional planning with multiple teams executing coordinated actions under central command. "Contingency protocols are active," Callahan confirmed. "Evidence secured through redundant channels. Emergency response personnel alerted through cutout contacts." After securing communications, Callahan implemented final defensive preparations. He verified weapons positioning throughout the property, ensuring access from multiple approaches. He confirmed that surveillance systems were recording to secured servers with off-site backup. He activated emergency medical caches positioned at strategic locations. Most importantly, he verified the specialized equipment installed throughout the property during the past 6 months, advanced countermeasures designed specifically for the tactics Veracruz operators typically employed. These systems remained dormant, revealing nothing to surveillance until activation would provide maximum tactical advantage. As darkness settled across the Chihuahuan Desert, Callahan observed increased activity at the Starlight Ranch Resort through thermal imaging. Vehicles were being prepared, personnel gathering for what appeared to be final briefing before deployment. The operational signature matched professional assault preparation, teams organizing equipment, conducting communications checks, reviewing tactical approaches. Callahan's expression remained neutral as he watched these preparations, though his thoughts turned briefly to Marcus Sullivan. 3 years of methodical planning had led to this moment, Ramirez deploying resources into a battlefield prepared specifically for this confrontation. The coming hours would determine whether justice would finally be secured for his fallen partner. With practiced efficiency, Callahan completed final positioning. He established a primary defensive location in the reinforced central room of the main house, with secondary positions prepared throughout the property. Communication systems were verified, weapons positioned for immediate access, medical supplies distributed at key locations. As the waxing moon rose over the eastern horizon, casting silver light across the rugged landscape, Jackson Callahan waited with the patience born from years of high-stakes operations. The hunter had become the hunted, though Ramirez had yet to realize how thoroughly Callahan had prepared for this precise scenario. The first indication of approaching trouble came at precisely 1:47 a.m., when perimeter sensors on the northwestern boundary transmitted silent alerts to Callahan's secure devices. The pattern of activation suggested professional operators moving with tactical discipline, maintaining appropriate spacing, using terrain features for concealment, advancing along unpredictable vectors to avoid potential defensive preparations. Through thermal imaging, Callahan identified 8 operators approaching from that direction. their movement patterns suggesting former military training, possibly special operations background based on their disciplined heat signatures and coordinated advancement. Their equipment profiles indicated tactical gear, including night vision capabilities, encrypted communications, and specialized breaching equipment. Simultaneously, secondary alerts activated on the southeastern approach, where additional operators were establishing positions overlooking the main house. Their positioning suggested standard pincer movement, establishing containment positions before primary assault teams breached the target location. Callahan had anticipated this approach. The northwestern boundary, with its varied terrain and natural concealment, represented the most logical insertion point for experienced operators. The southeastern position, offering elevated observation of the property, provided natural advantages for surveillance and covering fire. What the Veracruz operators couldn't know was how thoroughly Callahan had prepared these specific approaches. The northwestern terrain features that offered apparent concealment actually channeled movement through pre-established fields of fire. The southeastern elevation that seemed to provide tactical advantage had been prepared with countermeasures. Designed specifically for observation positions, Callahan activated secure communications to Sheriff Hawkins. Assault teams approaching my position, northwestern and southeastern vectors. Professional operators, approximately 15 personnel. Identified. Rebecca's response was immediate, though her voice maintained professional calm. Acknowledged. Response teams alerted but holding position per established protocol. Surveillance active on approach routes to document personnel and vehicles. Maintain distance, Callahan instructed. These aren't local criminals. They're experienced combat operators with superior firepower. Document activity, but avoid engagement unless civilian safety is directly threatened. The approaching assault teams maintained disciplined advancement, using thermal dampening techniques to minimize heat signatures and employing signal discipline to avoid electronic detection. Their operational security would have been effective against standard ranch security or conventional law enforcement, but proved insufficient against Callahan's sophisticated countermeasures specifically designed for their methodology. At the Starlight Ranch Resort, Victor Ramirez monitored the operation from a command center established in the main cabin. Multiple screens displayed tactical positioning, communications status, and surveillance footage. Maria Fuentes coordinated intelligence, while Alejandro Cortez managed operational elements. Team 1 in position, Cortez reported, monitoring encrypted communications. Containment teams established on the southeastern ridge. No defensive response detected. Ramirez studied the tactical display with professional assessment. Proceed with Phase 2. Electronic countermeasures active. Breach teams in position. The B operational plan reflected professional doctrine. Establish perimeter control, neutralize electronic security, execute simultaneous breach from multiple vectors, achieve objective securing before target can implement countermeasures. Against ordinary security, such methodical execution would prove devastatingly effective. At the McAllister Ranch, Callahan observed the deployment with tactical patience. Years of high-risk operations had taught him the value of allowing opponents to commit resources before revealing defensive capabilities. He watched as the assault teams achieved what they believed were advantageous positions, establishing the false confidence that would compromise their operational flexibility when unexpected resistance emerged. The assault began with simultaneous electronic warfare measures, signal jammers targeting standard communication frequencies, power disruption affecting conventional security systems, and drone surveillance providing real-time intelligence to assault coordinators. These measures would have isolated most targets from support resources and disabled standard defensive systems. Callahan had anticipated these precise measures. His communications operated on specialized frequencies immune to standard jamming techniques. His security systems maintained independent power sources hardened against electromagnetic interference. His counter-surveillance measures created false signatures that misled aerial observation platforms. The primary assault team initiated their approach at 2:17 a.m., advancing toward the main house with professional discipline. Their movement utilized natural concealment, maintained appropriate tactical spacing, and employed standard breach preparation techniques. Support teams established covering positions with interlocking fields of fire, designed to neutralize defensive responses. Through advanced observation equipment, Callahan identified team compositions and equipment profiles. The operators carried specialized breaching tools, tactical communications, and weapons configured for close-quarters combat. Their approach vectors and positioning suggested extensive planning based on property surveillance conducted over several days. What they couldn't have known was how this apparent thoroughness had been anticipated and incorporated into Callahan's defensive strategy. Each approach route contained disguised countermeasures designed specifically for the tactics they employed, not to inflict casualties, but to disrupt operational cohesion and force tactical reassessment. As the lead operators approached the first defensive perimeter, Callahan activated initial countermeasures. Specialized illumination suddenly flooded strategic areas, temporarily overwhelming night vision equipment calibrated for darkness. Directional sound systems broadcast disorienting frequencies designed to disrupt tactical communications. Prepositioned smoke dispensers released specialized compounds that interfered with thermal imaging without endangering personnel. The assault team's disciplined advance faltered momentarily as operators adjusted to these unexpected countermeasures. Their training allowed rapid adaptation, but the disruption forced communication and tactical reassessment that compromised their operational timeline. Team 1 reporting defensive measures activated, Cortez announced in the command center, his expression revealing professional concern. Technical countermeasures beyond standard security parameters. Ramirez studied the tactical display, reassessing the operation with cold precision. Proceed with alternate breach protocols, bypass electronic security, and implement direct entry. Procedures. The assault teams adjusted with professional competence, abandoning compromised approaches in favor of secondary vectors. Their operational flexibility allowed continued advancement despite unexpected resistance, though their carefully choreographed timing had been disrupted. Callahan observed this adaptation with clinical assessment. The operator's response confirmed his evaluation of their training level. These weren't ordinary security contractors, but experienced combat professionals accustomed to operational complications. Their adjustment demonstrated both tactical flexibility and disciplined command structure. As the teams reorganized for continued advancement, Callahan implemented secondary countermeasures. Prepared defensive positions activated, creating interlocking fields of fire covering likely approach vectors. Specialized barriers deployed, channeling movement through predetermined zones designed to separate assault elements and disrupt unit cohesion. The lead operators encountered these measures at 2:28 a.m. when apparent cover positions suddenly offered. No concealment and expected approach routes revealed themselves as tactical funnels. The professional discipline that had characterized their advance was tested as coordinated movement became increasingly difficult. Team 1 reporting sophisticated defensive preparations. The team leader's voice transmitted through encrypted channels. Pre-sighted fields of fire, prepared barriers, counterintelligence measures. This isn't standard security. We're facing professional defensive preparation. In the command center, Ramirez recognized the implications immediately. Callahan wasn't merely a former ranger who happened to purchase strategic property. He was a professional operator who had prepared specifically for this confrontation. The carefully planned assault had encountered not just resistance, but anticipation, as though their operational playbook had been studied and countered before implementation. "Tactical reassessment," Ramirez ordered, his voice maintaining calm authority despite the operational complications. "Withdraw to secondary positions. Implement Surveillance Protocol 7. We need complete pattern analysis before continuing." Engagement. The assault teams executed disciplined withdrawal, maintaining tactical integrity while repositioning to observation posts beyond the property's defensive perimeter. Their operational doctrine emphasized intelligence gathering over committed engagement when facing unexpected resistance. Preservation of assets took priority over objective completion when situational assessment proved inadequate. From his defensive position, Callahan observed their withdrawal with professional assessment. The operators' disciplined repositioning confirmed his analysis of their capabilities. These were experienced professionals who recognized the tactical disadvantage they faced and adjusted accordingly, rather than committing to compromised approaches. The initial assault had been repelled without direct engagement. Callahan's defensive preparations had disrupted their operational parameters sufficiently to force withdrawal without requiring lethal response. This outcome aligned perfectly with his strategic objective, documenting Veracruz' operational methodologies while preserving evidence-gathering capabilities. Sheriff Hawkins, monitoring from a secure position beyond the engagement zone, maintained communication with state and federal resources. Assault teams withdrawing from Callahan property, professional operators, military-grade equipment, coordinated tactical movement, clear evidence of organized criminal activity beyond standard jurisdiction. The DEA coordinator, observing through specialized surveillance from a concealed position near Study Butte, confirmed this assessment. Documented personnel match known Veracruz security contractors, equipment signature consistent with previous operations in Arizona and New Mexico, continuing surveillance while maintaining operational distance. As the Veracruz operators established observation positions beyond his defensive perimeter, Callahan implemented evidence protection protocols. The operational recordings from multiple surveillance systems were transmitted through secure channels to federal repositories. Documentation of equipment, personnel, and tactical methodologies provided evidentiary foundation for future prosecution. Most importantly, the initial engagement had confirmed Callahan's operational assessment. Ramirez was committing significant resources to direct action rather than continuing measured expansion. This tactical decision revealed both the importance of the Eastern Corridor to Veracruz operations and Ramirez's perception of Callahan as an immediate threat rather than a simple obstacle. The initial assault had been repelled, but Callahan harbored no illusions about the conflict's conclusion. Professional operators adapted to initial failure through tactical reassessment and approach modification. Ramirez would analyze defensive capabilities, identify perceived vulnerabilities, and implement adjusted operational parameters designed to overcome revealed countermeasures. The true test would come with secondary engagement, when Veracruz operators returned with a modified approach based on intelligence gathered during initial contact. Callahan had prepared for this evolution, implementing layered defenses designed to counter progressive tactical adaptation while documenting escalating criminal activity. As pre-dawn darkness maintained its hold over the Chihuahuan desert, both Callahan and Ramirez prepared for the operation's next phase. The initial engagement had transformed theoretical confrontation into activated conflict, with both strategists now possessing practical assessment of their opponent's capabilities. The quiet rancher and the cartel lieutenant had finally engaged directly, though neither appreciated how completely this confrontation would escalate beyond organizational objectives. into personal reckoning that had been brewing since that bloody day in Matamoros 3 years earlier. Dawn arrived with deceptive tranquility. Across the Chihuahuan desert, golden light illuminating the rugged landscape that had witnessed the night's aborted assault. At the Starlight Ranch Resort, Victor Ramirez convened an urgent reassessment with his operational leadership, their expressions revealing the professional concern of experienced tacticians facing unexpected resistance. Preliminary analysis confirms advanced defensive preparations, Maria Fuentes reported, displaying surveillance footage on the command center's main screen, integrated countermeasures, prepared fields of fire, sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. This isn't improvised security, it's professional defensive architecture implemented over months, possibly years. Alejandro Cortez, reviewing tactical data from the withdrawn assault teams, contributed additional assessment. Thermal imaging reveals reinforced positions throughout the property. Multiple hardened structures disguised as ordinary ranch improvements. Communication jamming. Countermeasures beyond commercial availability. The implications crystallized for Ramirez with cold clarity. He's been preparing specifically for us. The property acquisition, the defensive positioning, the intelligence gathering, all deliberately implemented to draw us into prepared killing grounds. Callahan's background provides explanation, Maria continued, displaying personnel files obtained through compromised law enforcement databases. Specialized counter-cartel operations throughout his Rangers career. Advanced training in asymmetric defense and electronic countermeasures. His final operation before retirement targeted our Matamoros distribution network. Ramirez's expression hardened as personal history connected with present circumstances. The Matamoros operation, where his partner died, Marcus Sullivan, Maria confirmed, younger brother of Captain James Sullivan, current Ranger Special Operations Commander. Official investigation concluded with insufficient evidence regarding intelligence compromise. Callahan apparently reached different conclusions. The tactical situation had evolved beyond organizational expansion into something more dangerous. Personal vendetta executed through professional methodology, with Callahan leveraging 3 years of preparation against Veracruz operational doctrine. Revise operational assessment, Ramirez instructed. This isn't territorial obstruction, it's targeted counter-operation designed specifically against our organization, likely focused on me personally. Callahan believes we were responsible for his partner's death and has positioned himself to pursue vengeance outside official channels. The revised assessment fundamentally altered operational parameters. What had been approached as standard territorial expansion now required adaptation to counter a sophisticated opponent with both personal motivation and professional capabilities. Direct assault proved ineffective, Cortez acknowledged. Conventional approaches encountered prepared countermeasures, suggesting thorough intelligence on our tactical doctrine. Alternative approaches required. Ramirez considered options with methodical assessment, weighing operational requirements against evolving threat landscape. We cannot abandon the Eastern Corridor. It's essential to our distribution network. Callahan's position remains an obstacle. That must be neutralized, but standard protocols require adjustment given his capabilities. The strategy that emerged combined multiple pressure vectors, targeting Callahan's support network, isolating his position through political leverage, deploying specialized assets beyond standard security contractors, and implementing psychological operations designed to force defensive overextension. Commissioner Davis provides leverage over county resources, Ramirez noted. Pressure Sheriff Hawkins through budget restrictions and jurisdictional challenges. Isolate Callahan from potential law enforcement support. The Martinez family rejected financial incentives, but remained vulnerable through their grandson, Maria added. Creating pressure against peripheral targets may force Callahan to extend protective resources beyond his prepared positions. Most significantly, Ramirez authorized deployment of specialized assets rarely utilized in territorial operations, personnel with advanced military backgrounds, equipment exceeding standard security parameters, and operational autonomy that enabled adaptive engagement without centralized authorization limitations. Contact Vega, Ramirez instructed Cortez, referring to Eduardo Vega, a former Mexican Special Forces commander who maintained a specialized team for high-risk operations. Full operational package, unrestricted equipment authorization, priority, compensation structure. The escalation extended beyond tactical adjustments to include broader strategic initiatives. Diego Suarez implemented accelerated financial operations, establishing legitimate business acquisitions throughout the region, creating political influence through targeted contributions, and developing economic leverage over essential resources, including water rights and transportation infrastructure. Expand community presence immediately, Ramirez directed. Accelerate public investment initiatives, increase visibility in local organizations, and implement direct support for essential services. We need legitimacy groundwork established before escalated operations attract outside attention. By mid-morning, these directives had activated multiple operational vectors simultaneously. Political pressure materialized through emergency county budget sessions, proposing significant reductions to Sheriff Hawkins' department resources. Financial operations accelerated with purchase offers for strategic properties surrounding Callahan's ranch. Technical specialists implemented sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities designed to isolate his communications and surveillance systems. Most concerning was the deployment of Eduardo Vega's specialized team, 12 operators with advanced military backgrounds, equipped with capabilities exceeding conventional security parameters. Their arrival at auxiliary property 10 miles from the McAllister Ranch represented significant escalation beyond standard territorial operations. At the McAllister Ranch, Jackson Callahan observed these developments through his intelligence network with professional assessment. Dylan Whitehorse provided first identification of Vega's team, having observed their arrival while making deliveries near their staging area. Different from previous personnel, the teenager reported during secure communication. Specialized equipment, including advanced breaching capabilities, electronic warfare packages, and tactical systems beyond standard contractor deployment. Their movement discipline suggests specialized military background rather than private security training. Sheriff Hawkins contributed additional intelligence gathered through legitimate law enforcement channels. Commissioner Davis has proposed emergency budget reallocation targeting department patrol resources, political leverage being applied against neighboring properties through water rights manipulation, multiple business acquisitions, creating an economic network throughout the region. Most significantly, Captain Sullivan provided intelligence from federal resources regarding Vega's operational history. Eduardo Vega, former GAFE commander, specialized in high-value target acquisition and asymmetric operations. Suspected involvement in multiple operations against competing cartels, characterized by exceptional violence and civilian casualties. His deployment represents significant escalation beyond standard security operations. Callahan integrated this intelligence into comprehensive operational assessment. Ramirez was implementing a multi-vector approach combining political isolation, economic pressure, technological countermeasures, and specialized assault capabilities. The strategy demonstrated professional adaptation to initial failure, acknowledging defensive preparations while developing alternative approaches designed to overcome revealed capabilities. The escalation required corresponding adjustments to Callahan's defensive strategy. He implemented enhanced surveillance covering approach vectors beyond immediate property boundaries. He activated secondary communication systems operating through encrypted satellite connections immune to regional interference. He verified evidence. Transmission protocols ensuring operational documentation reached secure repositories regardless of local communication status. Most importantly, he secured vulnerable community assets against potential targeting. The Martinez family received enhanced security through unofficial channels, surveillance equipment installed at their ranch, emergency response protocols established with trusted personnel, evacuation routes prepared if direct threats materialized. By early afternoon, Ramirez's escalation materialized through increasingly visible pressures throughout the community. Sheriff Hawkins found herself managing multiple administrative challenges simultaneously: budget restrictions, limiting patrol resources, jurisdictional disputes requiring immediate attention, personnel issues demanding administrative response. These manufactured crises achieved their objective, consuming department resources while limiting capability for monitoring Veracruz operations. Economic pressure manifested through coordinated actions against strategic properties. The Williams Ranch, already compromised through financial leverage, granted access easements allowing Veracruz personnel movement through western approach routes. Water rights restrictions suddenly affected properties refusing cooperation, with regulatory challenges appearing through compromised county offices. Business owners faced coordinated pressure combining financial incentives and implied threats, creating community division that complicated unified response. The Martinez family experienced direct intimidation for the first time. Their grandson, detained by university security based on manufactured drug allegations, their primary water well experiencing mechanical failure affecting livestock operations, regulatory inspections suddenly targeting their agricultural operations. These coordinated pressures demonstrated Ramirez's willingness to extend operations beyond direct confrontation, to include broader community targeting. Technological escalation became evident through sophisticated electronic warfare directed against Callahan's communications and surveillance systems. Signal jamming affected standard frequencies, drone surveillance maintained continuous observation of his property, and cyber operations targeted his digital infrastructure through multiple attack vectors. These measures would have isolated conventional opponents from support resources and intelligence capabilities. Callahan had anticipated these precise pressures, implementing countermeasures designed specifically for Veracruz methodologies. His communications operated through redundant systems immune to regional jamming. His surveillance incorporated counter-drone capabilities that provided false signatures to aerial observation. His digital security employed specialized architecture developed during his Ranger's career, creating deception layers that misdirected cyber operations while maintaining core functionality. Most importantly, Callahan's human intelligence network remained functional despite technological interference. Miguel Suarez provided ongoing intelligence regarding Veracruz movements through town. Dr. Chen monitored medical supplies requisitioned by newcomers, identifying preparation for potential casualties. Dylan Whitehorse maintained observation of supply movements, suggesting operational positioning. As evening approached, the escalation achieved Ramirez's immediate objective, creating multi-vector pressure that would traditionally force defensive overextension. Conventional security operations would struggle to maintain comprehensive coverage against simultaneous political, economic, technological, and tactical pressures. Resources would necessarily concentrate on immediate threats, creating vulnerabilities. Through attentional limitation, what Ramirez couldn't fully appreciate was how thoroughly Callahan had anticipated these precise pressures. His defensive preparation incorporated not just physical security, but comprehensive resistance across all pressure vectors. Political countermeasures through established federal connections, economic insulation through strategic resource positioning, technological resilience through specialized countermeasures, and tactical preparation addressing specific Veracruz methodologies. The true nature of Callahan's preparation revealed itself not in resistance to individual pressures, but in comprehensive resilience against coordinated escalation. Each pressure vector encountered not just specific countermeasures, but integrated response architecture designed specifically for Veracruz operational doctrine. As darkness settled across the Chihuahuan Desert, both strategic minds recognized the approaching culmination. Ramirez had committed significant resources to comprehensive escalation, creating conditions that would typically ensure operational success against even sophisticated opponents. Callahan had revealed only partial defensive capabilities, maintaining strategic reserves while documenting escalating criminal activity for eventual prosecution. The approaching confrontation would determine not just territorial control, but personal reckoning, whether Ramirez's tactical adaptation could overcome Callahan's methodical preparation, and whether justice for Marcus Sullivan would finally materialize through his partner's carefully orchestrated operation. The main assault began at precisely 2:14 a.m., when Vega's specialized team initiated coordinated approach from multiple vectors simultaneously. Unlike the previous operation's conventional methodology, this assault employed sophisticated infiltration techniques, minimized thermal signatures through specialized equipment, communication discipline, maintaining operational security, movement patterns leveraging terrain features beyond standard tactical doctrine. Through advanced surveillance, Callahan observed their approach with professional assessment. Vega's operators demonstrated capabilities exceeding conventional security contractors, their movement revealing specialized military training, their equipment incorporating advanced technological elements, their operational discipline suggesting extensive combat experience. Most notably, their approach vectors demonstrated thorough intelligence analysis, avoiding previously revealed defensive positions, utilizing concealment beyond ordinary observation capabilities, and implementing infiltration routes that bypassed standard security parameters. This operational adaptation reflected professional assessment of previous engagement, identifying perceived vulnerabilities while developing specialized countermeasures. At the Starlight Ranch Resort Command Center, Ramirez monitored the operation through encrypted communications and drone surveillance. Vega's team maintained minimal transmission discipline, utilizing specialized communication systems operating through frequency-hopping encryption immune to standard interception. Aerial observation platforms provided real-time intelligence regarding defensive positioning, creating operational awareness that standard assault teams couldn't achieve. Team Alpha breaching the southeastern perimeter, Cortez reported, monitoring tactical displays. No defensive response detected. Electronic countermeasures active, successfully neutralizing perimeter security. Ramirez studied operational progress with professional detachment, noting how Vega's methodology differed from conventional security operations. Where standard contractors employed a direct approach emphasizing overwhelming force, these specialized operators utilized surgical infiltration, emphasizing undetected penetration before coordinated action. What neither Ramirez nor Vega could fully appreciate was how accurately Callahan had anticipated this precise escalation. His defensive preparation included not just countermeasures against standard security operations, but specialized resistance designed specifically for advanced military methodology. Each infiltration route contained disguised detection systems, beyond commercial availability, monitoring approaches that conventional security would consider impenetrable. As Vega's operators penetrated the outer security perimeter, Callahan observed their movement while maintaining defensive patience. Years of high-stakes operations had taught him the value of allowing opponents to commit resources before revealing countermeasures, establishing false confidence that compromised operational flexibility when unexpected resistance emerged. The infiltration teams advanced with exceptional discipline, maintaining minimal signatures while establishing tactical positioning throughout the property. Their movement suggested specialized night operations training, utilizing ambient light conditions, employing terrain features for concealment, maintaining unit cohesion through non-verbal communication protocols. At precisely 2:47 a.m. with infiltration, teams established in primary assault positions, Vega initiated coordinated action through an encrypted command channel. Specialized breaching teams approached the main house from multiple vectors simultaneously, employing advanced entry techniques designed to overcome reinforced construction. Support teams established overlapping fields of fire covering potential defensive positions. Technical specialists implemented electronic warfare measures targeting communication and surveillance systems. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.